Welcome to another week's analysis behind the news. Get out your pen and paper because I'm going to give you some information that I know you'll want to read for yourself. While you're doing that, just a couple of superficial things that were in the New York Times yesterday was this cartoon strip, for instance, in one of the sections of the New York Times, and it's lambasting the churches going into business. It's a very, very terrible, in my opinion, cartoon. It's aimed at the Catholic Church primarily over this contraception regulation and everything in regards to insurance and so on and so forth. And it really takes a shot at anybody that's got a business and is in the church business, so to speak, at any rate. The next page is an article on Egypt, never-ending revolution. And of course, it's written by Stephen Cook, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, telling us again what to think about the situation in Egypt, while organizations, as we've been expressing, are active from the United States, NGOs, non-government organizations, are active in Egypt to bring about a change in Egypt, and that change is more and more of a radical Muslim government. These CFR people there are operating there, while CFR people here are telling us in the newspapers that all this is wonderful and necessary and so on and so forth. It's the same thing that's been going on for years. We have CFR people or CIA people manipulating things overseas, and we've got them here in the government setting the stage for that manipulation. It's the same way with the communists. We have communists in our government who make it appear as though we're fighting communists overseas. But really it's a Punch and Judy show. It's the same person behind the scenes, but you got Punch and you got Judy, and they're supposedly arguing with one another, but really it's the same body. And in the past I've mentioned things that have been, I guess you would say, very difficult to believe. One of the things, for instance, is something I showed you out of a Life magazine recently, but here is one that's even better. And this is a little light reading for you. Start to jot this down. I'll talk slow for you public school graduates. And this is a book by Herbert Hoover. Now again, for you public school people, this is the president that preceded the savior of America, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. At least that's the way they portray it in the history books. But this president, Herbert Hoover, wrote this tome titled Freedom Betrayed. And it was written last year. You can go on into Amazon and find it. It is edited and introduced by George H. Nash, but it was actually written by Herbert Hoover. In here, he documents the fact that Roosevelt got us into World War II, that the Japanese, as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, were trying everything to get out of going to war with the United States. There was a peace party in Japan that was negotiated, actually the government under Kenoe, the prince, who was trying to not go to war with the United States. They were willing to withdraw from China, et cetera, et cetera. We don't want a war with the United States. Because of the manipulation of Roosevelt, none of these negotiations even took place, even when the repeated times that the Japanese government tried to sit down with us. And of course you see on the History Channel and your history books that they came to the Washington, D.C. and all the rest of it, but most of the time they were sitting in a hotel room. It led to the rise of the War Party because of the breakdown of these negotiations. And by the time these individuals came to Washington, D.C., the War Party was already in power. So at any rate, he documents this in here. He also documents in here that they tried to surrender about a year and a half before the final conclusion of the war. They didn't want to continue the war, and yet Roosevelt did. And why did he? Simply put, because they wanted to build up the United Nations. They had to put the United Nations structure in place. They had to program the American people into accepting the United Nations in the name of peace. They were getting tired of war. It was a costly affair. You know what war does. The newsreels in the theaters, for instance, were showing men landing on islands, calling them the United Nations troops instead of allies or American soldiers. You go back and watch that March of Time and those newsreels that were in the theaters in those days. That's what they were doing. They were setting the stage for the United Nations. And I kind of left you hanging last week in regards to why the Russians wanted us to go into Korea and what they're doing in Syria today and so on and so forth through the United Nations. I related where the Russians supposedly got mad, left the Security Council, which gave us the opportunity to be able to go in and save Korea. That is the overview in your history books. What really happened was this. The Russians wanted us to go into Korea simply because it was the first time that our armed forces fought officially under the banner of the United Nations. The United Nations flag flew over South Korea, not the American flag. Our boys were buried under the United Nations flag in Korea, not the U.S. flag. The daily operations of our armed forces were dictated by the United Nations. Every time the commanders in Korea formulated some plans, these plans had to be submitted to the United Nations in their military commission, which just happened to be run by a Russian, who then informed Moscow, who then informed Peking, who then informed Pyongyang, or whatever it's called up there in North Korea. And now it may have been delayed by a few hours and that sort of thing, but it was in some cases we know, and MacArthur knew, that our armed forces were being hamstrung by giving these orders to the UN before we gave them to our own troops. So he stopped doing it. He stopped telling the United Nations what he was going to do, and that's what got him in trouble. That's the thing behind the scenes that was going on that you don't read about in your newspaper articles or in your history books. And that's the purpose of these spots online, is to give some background behind what's going on that you're not aware of. Jump forward to North Africa and the Middle East. What's going on in these instances, and particularly in Syria, has all the earmarks of helping build a permanent United Nations army. That has always been the goal of the United Nations. We even put out a publication from the 1960-61 era, which showed that our State Department had developed an official policy of disarming the United States, but not getting rid of the armies and everything, just moving them in under the leadership of the United Nations. And we put out a lot of information on that. We were able to stop that plan from coming to fruition, but that is still the plan. They want United States troops under UN command. It was so bad in the Balkans under Clinton, our troops there even wore UN blue berets. Now, they don't do that very often because pictures of that kind of thing would alert American voters to the fact that, hey, wait a minute, these are our troops. These are our fighting men and women. They are not the United Nations. They don't belong to the General Assembly. They don't belong to the Security Council. They belong to the people of the United States through the Congress of the United States. And so they don't often do that anymore. But that is the plan, is to ultimately build a UN army. And that has all the appearance of what's going on now with the cry, just this last week, of a joint UN Arab League initiative to send troops into Syria. It will be one more step towards establishing a permanent UN army. Most people don't realize it, but all around the world, we have our troops stationed, like in Macedonia and in the Balkans, under UN auspices. They aren't, even down in, for a while we were even there in the Sinai, between the Egyptians and the Palestinians and Israelis, as a UN force, not as a United States force, but they were our fighting men and women. That's what's going on. That's the design about all that you see in your papers. They'll give you a lot of verbiage They'll give you a lot of subterfuge, but that's the main point. Till next week, we'll see you then.